Hello, welcome. I'm Gabby, and this is the Happier Life Project podcast, brought to you by the free, award-winning mental health and wellness app, My Possible Self. Today, we're diving into the profound impact of the climate emergency on mental health and well-being. Terms like eco-anxiety, ecological grief, environmental doom and eco-guilt are phrases that I hadn't come across, to be honest, until recently, but they are becoming more and more common as people struggle with the emotional toll of climate change. These feelings reveal a deep connection between our mental state and the environmental crisis, underscoring the urgent need to care for both the planet's health and our own. Our guest today, Dr. Emma Lawrance, is at the forefront of this conversation. She leads the Climate Care Centre at Imperial College London, a research initiative developed over the past 4 years to study the link between climate change and mental health. Emma works with a diverse range of experts to explore these connections, including through the global initiative Connecting Climate Minds, which you'll hear much more about in today's conversation. In addition to her role at the Climate Care Centre, Dr. Emma is the Mental Health Innovations Fellow at the Institute of Global Health Innovation, where she leads their mental health strategy. Emma's focus is on advancing research and innovation in digital mental health support, whilst also tackling the critical overlap between climate change and mental well-being. In today's very episode of the Happier Life Project, Dr. Emma and I will be discussing how to navigate the emotional challenges of living in a rapidly changing world. We'll explore the practical actions we can take to protect our planet, not just to ensure its survival, but to safeguard our own well-being too. Nature plays an essential role on our emotional, psychological and physical health, something we can't afford to overlook. Depending on where you live, your environment can either be a powerful ally or a significant challenge. And you're going to hear Emma's passionate perspective on why she believes climate action is mental health action. Together, we'll unpack the deep connection between a healthy planet and a healthy mind, and talk about why caring for the Earth is also an act of self-care. So, if you're ready to discover how a healthier planet can lead to a healthier, happier you, let's get started. Dr. Emma Lawrance, welcome to the Happier Life Project podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to get into this with you and hopefully to open people's eyes and ears on this topic of conversation. In fact, I've got, I guess you'd say, 3 agendas for our chat today. Number 1 is to learn about the intersection of the climate and mental health. Number 2 is to educate and show compassion for those who are suffering with their mental health due to the impact of the climate crisis. And number 3 is to highlight how vital the climate is for our mental health and why we must all strive to protect it the way it protects us. You know?
Brilliant.
So we've got a lot to get stuck into.
A lot to get stuck into, but no, that sounds like a great agenda.
Okay, well, before we get into all of that, in the solo introduction, the listeners will have learned about you and your background, but I'd love it if you could share your story on how you got into this specific field, because it has to come, I think, with a personal story and a lot of passion behind it.
Yeah, thanks so much. And you're totally right that I think everyone working in the fields of climate change or mental health or both often comes into those spaces because they've had their own experiences or they feel very deeply for others around the world, or what they see in non-human nature and how they're being affected. So for me, a lot of strands of my life story came together at the nexus of climate and mental health. So I grew up on Kaurna country in the Adelaide Hills in Australia. And I was very fortunate to be surrounded by trees and koalas and birds and all of these things that I was, delighted in spending my time playing around and with. But once I started studying science, which among many of my passions became an interest of mine, and also what my undergraduate degree was in physics and chemistry, and I started learning about this warming world and the threats to the environment from climate change. I thought, this is something really serious. We'll need to do something about this as a global community. But this was 20 years ago plus. And I never imagined at the time that it would be something that would be so big in my lifetime. I thought it would be something that would be about my children or my grandchildren. But then, in recent years, we've started to see more and more how the landscape that I grew up in is being affected, when there's big bushfires that went through the Adelaide Hills. And even though luckily my family weren't in danger, there was smoke in my family's house. You can wake up and smell, and it's getting hotter and drier and more unpredictable. And the reefs are dying, and all of these landscapes that I felt very close to and very emotionally affected by. And I'd done climate activism and as a young person myself when that label applied to me in Australia. But at the same time, I'd grown up experiencing quite severe mental illness in my teen years and early 20s. And so I ended up, through a whole series of things, coming to Oxford 12 years ago now to study neuroscience and try and understand more about how our brain works, and in particular related to an understanding of mental health. And so my PhD, I was using fMRI, and I was looking at how the brain makes decisions under uncertainty and different forms of uncertainty in different parts of the brain, and how that interacts with anxiety. And we know that intolerance of uncertainty really cross-cuts a lot of mental health challenges. Alongside that, I founded a youth mental health charity to share video messages of hope and support for young people experiencing mental health challenges for the first time. And so I was really passionate about sort of storytelling and hearing young people's stories. And I ended up, after my studies, working at Imperial College London in mental health research and with youth mental health charities. And I was really sort of in 2018, 2019, just really struck that I was so personally affected by, I guess, what would be called climate anxiety, or this sense of struggling with so many different emotions and thoughts and feelings that I'm sure we'll unpack. And also seeing that in other people around me. And also from my studies, knowing how challenging uncertainty is and compounding uncertainties, but then not seeing that reflected in how we were talking about youth mental health in the spaces that I was in and what might be challenging youth mental health. And so I was really struck that we weren't talking about what's the environment the young children are inheriting, what is the uncertainties and the challenges for their future that are kind of compounding with, at the time, Brexit and climate change and then this pandemic. And, the only thing that was really big were things like social media or exam stress, all of which are important, but it felt like it was missing this big, wider context. And so, I started looking into that. And of course, once you do, as it sounds like you have recently as well,
yes,
start realizing that actually there are deep, deep interconnections, common causes, common solutions between what's plaguing our climate and our minds. And there are many ways that the climate crisis is affecting mental health, and much more directly than just me being worried about this, but when people are directly experiencing high temperatures or extreme weather events or all of the things that we'll be discussing, just the huge flow-on consequences for mental health, and just saw this massive gap in both the evidence, the awareness, the policy spaces. And so, just started trying to address that in whatever ways I could. And that has kind of snowballed through a lot of wonderful people coming in to the work and to the space into what's now the Climate Care Centre.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And it's incredible work. And like I mentioned before we officially started recording, I suppose, I've really been digging into your material. And once you know it, then you can't unknow it. And you're right, we are going to be unpacking some of this. Listening to your story, I'm reassured to hear that the younger generation are concerned because they're right to be concerned. And I guess, don't want to label anybody or stigmatize or anything, but when you think of teenagers, you think of them being stuck to the smartphones. And I'm generalizing here very much, but I do find it reassuring to hear that they do care, because they are, hopefully can make a positive change where perhaps people of the older generation are falling short.
Yeah, I think it's very important to note that in general, there's this big misconception that people don't care about climate change. And that's been really driven and perpetuated in many ways by the fossil fuel industry. They're wanting to push this narrative, even in policy spaces, that it's not a winning policy to go after climate policies because people don't care. But actually, when there's big global surveys, the vast majority of people do care, do want more climate action, would pay some of their salary towards climate action. And when you ask people how much they care versus how much they think others care, there's a big gap. So even though the majority of people say, well, I really care, when you ask them to rate how much others would care, they would say that it's like the minority. So there's this big perceptual gap. And so I think we can feel alone in caring, but actually, people do want to see these changes because it's not only protecting us from this worsening future that people can sort of mostly see playing out. Of course, there are pockets of denial, but most people can see playing out. But also, it's an opportunity to create a better world in the process. But for young people, there, of course, like any group, there'll be, of any age, there'll be people who will have all sorts of different thoughts and feelings. But the majority of young people in most surveys, in particularly in parts of the world that are already quite affected by climate change, are very worried, or that it's something that they are thinking about. And of course, for some people, that might be something that they're really thinking about a lot all the time, and for others, it might be part of a mixture of lots of other things that are going on for them. But I guess one other point that you were sort of saying is that it gives you hope for them to be able to do something. A challenging thing for some of the young people we work with around the world is feeling that sense of responsibility being placed on them. And a lot of the distress and anger can understandably come from that intergenerational injustice where they're being asked to clean up a mess they weren't responsible for. And actually, there are people who are in positions of power today who need to be the ones making the decisions to protect their future. And they don't have the power, and their voices aren't heard in these decisions in the ways that they need to be. And their futures are being mortgaged to pay for record profits in coal, oil, and gas today.
I mean, that's completely fair enough too, isn't it? And I suppose I say that just thinking, like, I suppose many do that, like, you care, but then you feel a bit powerless and you feel like, well, what can I do? Or if I do my recycling, is that really going to change things? That I think this is surely something you come across a lot, this feeling of like, of course I care. Like I love nature, but then it's like, well, what do we do when you're going up against these big coal and oil industries and whatnot?
Yeah. So yeah, is, as you say, a very common experience, is that sense of, you said the word sort of powerlessness. And that's something we hear a lot. I mean, just anecdotally, we had an engagement with Imperial College London. They had a sort of a big open day and this great exhibition road festival. And when we asked the public, what emotions they felt around the climate crisis and have this whole wheel to choose from, powerlessness came up, actually the top one for this sample of people from England. And that's something, again, we hear many, many times. And I feel it myself as well quite a lot sometimes. I guess there's a couple of things to say. One is that we aren't individually responsible for all of the change that needs to happen. And sometimes there can be almost too much focus put on individuals' carbon footprints, which again has been a narrative that the fossil fuel industry really loves, because it takes away from what they need to do. It's like, oh, individuals just need to change, and we need to look at individual carbon footprints. But at the same time, change does also come like bottom up as well as top down. And it is the power of the people kind of not acting as individuals. There's this wonderful quote of, the best thing you can do about climate change, the best individual action for climate change is not being an individual. And it's through joining with others and through doing things, whether it's in your workplace or your school or your hospital or, your community garden or whatever it is. Those changes can start to really give examples to other people. And then that starts to change, and it creates these ripple effects, and it starts to like change in complex systems happens in sometimes unpredictable ways. And we've seen that in many times in history. But once you start getting these social tipping points where, the more people do things and other people see that they're doing things, things can start to really spread and change. So people's actions, it's not just through the change in emissions themselves, but it's through the conversations that they're having, raising awareness of this, like talking to people about it, sharing how you're feeling about it, realizing that other people care, but are maybe not sure what to do, but seeing that there are also actions that individuals can do, like reducing the amount of red meat we eat, reducing the amount that we fly, making sure our money is in places that are not going towards furthering more fossil fuels in the world. So do we know where our pensions are going? Do we know whether our bank supports fossil fuel companies? So I've divested, for instance, all of my money out of banks that support funding fossil fuel projects. And that's one thing I can do that makes you feel like, when we talk about where the funding goes, that actually people doing that kind of action and universities doing that kind of action now, we start to change the social license to operate. We start to say, no, this is not what we want. We want this instead. And that can have these big ripple effects. So there is a lot of power, but also, we have to create space to hold the understandable and challenging emotions of where we're at, but also to see how much progress is also being made, how much change is occurring, how much, the renewable sector is exploding, how many other communities and people around the world are creating change, and that at the same time as holding the challenges, also seeing the progress.
Well, when you're talking about the tipping point and influencing people and the ripple effects, then for anybody listening right now, let's give you some incentives, because I wanted to quickly touch upon, when we have access to nature, the positives for our mental health. So I'll just reel these out, Emma, and if you want to jump in at any point, then feel free. When we have access to nature, this leads to stress reduction. Natural environments such as parks, forests, and beaches have been shown to reduce stress, anxiety, and depression. Exposure to green spaces can lower cortisol levels and promote relaxation. Improved mood. Spending time in nature has been linked to enhanced mood and greater emotional well-being. Activities like walking in the park or gardening can increase happiness and reduce negative emotions. Cognitive benefits. Nature exposure can improve cognitive function, attention, and creativity. It has been shown to restore mental fatigue and enhance focus. And community, social interaction, and a sense of belonging, which you touched upon. Environments that encourage social interaction, such as community centres, playgrounds, and neighbourhood parks, can foster social support networks, which are essential for mental health. Safe, clean, and well-maintained environments contribute to a sense of community and belonging, which is associated with lower levels of depression and anxiety. There's a neuroscientist in the UK called Dr. Tara Swartz, and I loved a quote that she said, "Nature is the palette we've existed in for all of humanity, and therefore the awe and the beauty of nature has an effect on us mentally." So there's all these great things for our mental health. I just kind of want to make sure we acknowledge the positive side, because this should be incentivizing, shouldn't it? That we want to protect nature, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one thing I just wanted to quickly say on the last question as well was that, climate change and the ecological crises can be seen as sort of a political issue. But actually, like you say, you know, as humans, we have these affinity for the natural world. It can benefit our health in so many ways. And I think just it's so powerful because we need to be creating that space where decision makers know this is what people care about, and companies and leaders are held to account to protect our health and the health of our children. And we know that, as you said, both physical and mental health, we know that it really depends on a secure environment, a healthy environment, and we have a right to that in you know, that there are human rights that include a right to a healthy environment, that now some countries are being taken to court for not doing enough to protect people's, you know, health through that right to a healthy environment. And so it is important to center that by doing these things, by protecting our environment, we're really protecting our health and well-being and our mental health. Because, as you said, when we have food and water security, when we don't have, you know, the cost of living crisis is also partly connected to the climate crisis. All of these crises are connected.
Yeah.
Air pollution, we know, leads to more depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, dementia. When we clean our air, when we reduce burning fossil fuels, when we are more active in the ways that we move around our cities, where we have spaces where we can easily meet up with our friends, when our children can easily meet up with our friends or play in a park, all of these things will help protect against the threats from a changing climate, like greater heat in cities, for instance, but also they can contribute towards, that safer climate future. So if we do transition away from fossil fuels, if we do support biodiversity, if we do support changes to our agricultural systems, the food will be better for us. We will be healthier. The air will be cleaner for us. We will be healthier. And our mental health will improve. As you said, feeling connected to nature, spending time in nature, but also just, having more trees in cities, more green space in cities, cleaner air, cleaner beaches. All of these things are kind of creating that foundation for an environment that supports good mental health.
And I'd just like to add as well about the weather and our mood, just kind of, again, enforcing or just reaching for the word, and I can't think of it, but we're happier when the sun is out, unless it's too hot, and then we might feel lethargic. We're grumpy or we're irritated when it doesn't stop raining. But we'll always marvel at a rainbow. We feel low or down when the weather is gloomy. So we are so connected, and we just forget, I think, for the most part, you know. And this was just a fun fact that I'll share with you. And it's about birds. Bird song reduces our blood pressure and stress levels. And this is apparently because if there was a predator around, the birds wouldn't sing. So therefore, the fact that when we hear the birds are singing, it means that we are safe. It's things like this, we're just like...
Yeah, our bodies respond, as you said, you know, we are part of nature. We're not apart from nature. And I've been fortunate enough to grow up in a space where that was completely obvious to me, and that everything is interconnected. And so if you look at how connected the health of different parts of ecosystems are to each other, it becomes completely impossible to have the delusional belief that humans can kind of continue to extract or exploit the planet or push through planetary boundaries and not affect our own health. That's something that cultures, many, many cultures around the world experience very deeply and is intimately associated with how they even describe mental health. So for, you know, many of the communities that I've had the privilege of listening to and working with, and Indigenous cultures and communities, Pacific Islanders, people from all parts of the world. We've worked the last year with a Wellcome funded project called Connecting Climate Minds. We worked with over 960 people from very diverse backgrounds across 90 countries. And many of them, it's impossible to talk about mental health without talking about emotional, spiritual, social, cultural, land health. And they'll talk about, you know, one Maori participant and contributor was saying, you know, when the land is well, I am well. But our bodies respond physiologically, and could be seen as a spiritual thing, but we know scientifically as well that the microbes in soil can change your body's immune system. And we know the immune system is intimately connected to our brain function, to mental health. We're learning more and more about the gut-brain axis. We're learning all of these things that are also connected to the air we breathe, to the soil we play in, to the foods that we eat. And as you said, to the sounds that we hear, like noise pollution has a big impact on mental health. And breathing, there's trees release molecules that can help us feel less stressed, as you said. And so we're very, very intimately connected. And that's what we see in the climate crisis as well, that it's this risk factor, this multiplication of vulnerabilities. But also when we start doing things, whether we care about social justice, whether we care about women's rights, whether we care about mental health, we can start getting these big wins when we start addressing the kind of common causes and then seeing these common solutions across many of the challenges in our society that sort of stem from this exacerbation of inequalities or continued extractivism and overusing planetary resources, burning fossil fuels. That we know that when we transition away from these things, it's not just a nice kind of environmentalist view, but a very clear scientific view that can hugely benefit human health and well-being.
Absolutely.
If it's done in the right ways, knowing that we need a just transition and knowing that we need to also consider risks and provide support for people when they're making life changes, etc. as well. So not to say that there's not considerations, but just, we as humans are part of this system that our life and our lifestyle intimately depends upon the wider world.
So if we zoom out for a second, then how does climate change affect mental health on a global scale? Like what are I think you've touched upon a few of them already, but like, what are some of the big challenges?
Yeah, so it's a huge range. When we talk about the climate crisis, it's, again, this kind of multiplier of risk. It's really escalating these pathways by which mental health might be impacted. So we know things like food and water insecurity or forced migration or conflict can worsen mental health, but the climate crisis is making it more likely that those kind of things happen. It's making it more likely that people get infectious diseases. It's making it more likely that people are forced from their homes. And all of that is because of, it's more likely that there's extreme and frequent climate and weather events like droughts, floods, wildfires. I have collaborators that I'm very grateful to have around the world. And, one of them is in the Philippines now. His home was underwater a couple of weeks ago from a mega typhoon. Our collaborator in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, has been trying to support all of his colleagues across the Caribbean nations who've been hit by several hurricanes the early part of this year. My colleague in Nigeria is trying to support communities and their mental health in the floods that are happening. We talk often about the number of people who die in those kind of events or the economic costs, but what we don't talk about is what that looks like for the people psychologically and mentally who may likely to experience anxiety and depression or die by suicide, to experience post-traumatic stress, to turn to substances to cope. And these are happening more frequently, so people can't adapt as much or recover before the next thing hits or before the next thing happens to stress their livelihoods, to stress their homes, to stress their cultures, their communities. And we know also direct exposure to heat can really affect mental health. So as you noted, we know that when it's sunny, when there's sunshine hours, that can be good for mental health and mood. But actually, when we experience increasing temperatures and extreme temperatures, that seems to be linked to, sadly, more deaths by suicide in some cases, and more people going to hospital with psychiatric conditions, and people who have pre-existing mental health challenges like schizophrenia, for example, seem more likely to be at physical risk of heat stress and death in heat waves. And the other end of the spectrum, just witnessing this happening or being aware of this happening to yourself, to your family, to people and places you care about now and into the future, can also be understandably very distressing. So there's this kind of compounding, interacting effects of different pathways and mechanisms, but mental health well-being, quality of life can often be the ultimate casualty here.
Mm. Yeah, well, I just made a couple of notes from one of your presentations online. Across 25 countries, negative emotions about climate change are related to insomnia and poorer mental health. And what you were saying about the suicides in relation to the higher temperatures, by 2050, there will be an estimated 22,000 extra suicides in the US and Mexico alone due to high temperatures if climate change is not addressed. We need to do something. Or do we need to do more? Or are we just at the hands of our leaders, basically? How do we do something, Emma?
Yeah,
You know?
no, absolutely. So I think there's a couple of things here. One is that in terms of, as you say, what do we do about sort of stopping this happening in the first place? And that's what's called kind of climate mitigation. And that's where we want to be moving away from putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as societies and transitioning in ways that obviously support people in what's called a just transition. So, if someone's working in coal mine, we don't want to just make them unemployed, but making sure that they have the right support and compensation, all these things as one example, but just in general, looking at how we help countries, economies transition in ways that are fair and supportive and just. But in general, yes, societies need to be moving away from burning fossil fuels, from agriculture that's unsustainable. And in terms of what do we do, are we just waiting for leaders? So there's, again, as individuals, there's a lot of power in starting to change the narrative around this from something where it's acceptable for fossil fuel companies to continue to have record profits, to continue to get government subsidies, to a situation where we say, actually, no, that's not fair, that's not right, that's not healthy for me, this is toxic for my family. And the more people start to talk about that, the more people, everyone listening to this, the more they kind of have those conversations with other people about, what do you think about this? And did you know this? And that can start to create the environment that can hold leaders to account and say, actually, this is what we want. And of course, some people take action in lots of different ways, and there's lots of different groups now to take action to push for these changes. But as I said, also the transition needs to happen in all parts of society. So every career needs to be a climate career. So are we thinking about where the money in our institution is going? Is our work funded by banks who are bankrolling these fossil fuels? Are we starting to think in this systems way?
How would we find that out? Like, would it be online if we Googled whichever bank we're with? And
yeah, you can. Yeah, there is information out there. Yeah. So, and to just be starting to ask these questions, like to your employers, to you, what are we doing about climate change? What are our plans? Have we thought about this? But then there's also making sure that mental health is seen and talked about as both that it's going to be hurt and is being hurt by the climate crisis, but also can be beneficial to have climate action. It can help mental health and create a future that supports mental health in different ways. And that narrative needs to be out there. So raising awareness that actually, did you know mental health is being hit by the climate crisis? And actually climate action can be really good for mental health. Are we talking about that? Do people know about that? And do people know how to protect themselves then from the changes that are occurring? And that's what's called sort of climate adaptation. So again, often at council levels, at city levels, at country levels, there's plans around adapting to climate change and also transitioning away from emissions and making sure that health and human health and mental health is included in those plans, talking potentially to your local council, but also, or if you're someone who feels comfortable talking to or writing to your MP, but also in your school or your neighborhood, what are the plans to, if there is a heat wave, how do we protect people who might be more vulnerable? Are we thinking about, can we contribute to more green space? Are we sort of pushing for that? Are we talking about the health benefits of that? Are we thinking about maybe cycling to work rather than driving for our own health as well as like what that might contribute to the planet? There's a lot of win-wins, and different things will be right for different people. I'm not trying to say there'll be one thing or the other, but yeah, when we think about building resilience to the changes that might come, One big thing is social resilience and psychological resilience. So when disasters happen, and we saw this with the pandemic, one of the big differences between whether people can thrive or not after that is, or their mental health is severely affected, and also whether they feel they can take action or not, actually is about the strength of the community bonds. And we heard this even talking to farmers around the world who've been hit really hard by the climate crisis. And sometimes they've come together as a community and made big changes and taken action. And other times they've really just, there's been really severe poor mental health outcomes. And anecdotally, one of the things, they were saying is just like how strong those community bonds were. And we know that strong relationships are really, really good for mental health. So again, strengthening your community, knowing how you could support people in your community when these things happen, but even beforehand, or if you're someone who is feeling eco-anxiety or worried about this, finding spaces, there are now climate cafes that happen, or spaces where you can talk to other people. Maybe you could start a space in your workplace to talk about it and build that agency to take action, but also to create spaces to process some of those emotions and build that capacity to sit with uncertainty and some of the challenging emotions that come with the climate crisis.
I think we can do more than we actually realize we can do as well. And I think that stems from education. Certainly when I was researching ahead of our chat, I learned stuff just by going out looking for it, like what you said about how we can find out where the bank's money is going and if it's going in the wrong places or funding the wrong, initiatives or whatever. So I guess I want to make sure that I ask you, do you recommend any resources where we could look at things we could potentially do on a personal level? And I've got an example, because this is something I'm going to do. You're going to see how it sort of is intertwined. And this is about vapes and vaping. So research shows that vaping is harmful to mental health as well as physical health. New studies show the links between vaping and mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, psychosis, and eating disorders. The reason young adults start vaping is often related to mental health. A Truth Initiative survey found that 4 out of 5 young adults began vaping due to stress, anxiety, or depression. However, the negative impact of vaping, and you'll see how this is all going to come full circle with the environment, the negative impact of vaping far outweighs any temporary relief from symptoms. In fact, the effects of vaping on the brain and body can make existing symptoms worse. This was published last year by the American Heart Association. A study of more than 2,500 people aged 13 to 24 found that nicotine-only vapors, THC-only vapors, and dual vapors of nicotine and THC were more likely to report anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, and suicidal thoughts when compared with their peers who did not use electronic cigarettes or vapes. I've got so many stats on this, so I'm going to kind of skip ahead. So vaping is not only bad for our mental health, but also environmental health. Vaping does contribute to air pollution. While e-cigarettes may produce fewer toxins than traditional cigarettes, they do release aerosols into the air. These aerosols contain nicotine and other potentially harmful chemicals, which can contaminate the air around the user. Most vapes contain metals, which can take many years to decompose. Vapes also have plastic, and plastic never fully decomposes. Rather than decomposing, plastic turns into microplastics or tiny pieces of plastics, which continue to pollute the environment and pollute our food and drinking water. I'm sorry, there was a lot in that, but I wanted to use that as a point of maybe because, a lot of young people vape. They might not realize that not only could they protect their own mental health better, but the environment as well, if they could look at potentially knocking that on the head. So it's things like that, Emma, I guess, that is a very long-winded way of me getting to using deodorants. It's better to use roll-on than aerosol, I would imagine. It's these kind of changes that I don't know if it does get taught in schools. It didn't when I went to school.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, that is one example. But like you said, there's many examples where there's these very clear win-wins. Like people who live in cold homes that are poorly insulated can get sick more. They go off work, their kids are taken out of school. There's a lot of stress around, do I heat, do I eat? There's mental health effects of being in that cold home, for instance. And so retrofitting buildings can, and there's a project called Shine that's been doing this in London, where they pair up like GPs and they can essentially refer people to get these free sort of home retrofits. And it's been reduced emissions, but also improved health outcomes and less doctors visit. It saves the NHS money. And so in terms of that's just one example again, but this applies across. And, you're talking about air pollution. Home cooking with gas is another thing that is really bad for people. Indoor air pollution affects every organ in our body, including our brain and our mental health. So, and vaping, the same. So there are all of these ways, but one is around awareness, like you said, and two is around the right support structures, both like policy support structures and mental health support structures to enable people to sort of make sometimes those transitions. And in the context of what you were saying around vaping, it's obviously nicotine can be an addictive substance. So making sure again that people have the right support to make the transitions. But in terms of when it comes back to that education piece, the Climate Care Centre, we're working on a project now to work with schools, with teachers, with young people, with lots of different other partners who are already working in this space, including the Anna Freud Centre, to integrate climate education and mental health education, because there's a lot of overlap with what we need to learn to live well and thrive in a rapidly changing world, and what we need to do to have the capacity to sustain climate action and sustain ourselves through the transition. Because, taking action can, in some cases, be good for mental health, but also people can get burnout, that it's not a simple picture. And we need to make sure that when people are learning about the challenges of the climate crisis, they're also learning around the narratives that they're being sold by different parts of society, by vested interest, what actually is going on, what vision of the future can be created, how we can create this world that's better for us and better for the climate, together, and what their agency and role is within that, but also how they can build their resilience to cope and find meaning. This is about finding happiness and finding that sense of meaning, of purpose, of sitting with those uncomfortable emotions, sitting with the uncertainties, and being able to hold multiple things together, being able to hold the fear and the grief and anger and the hope, and take those actions in sustainable ways. And what those actions are and what those look like in practice, and where this is already happening around the world, and how cities are changing. Paris is making it so much easier to cycle than it used to be, and you see the way that the streets are changing and what that does for the experience of living in that city, as well as what it does for people's health and the emissions. So there's a lot of win-wins, and it's about showcasing those and people being able to see how that fits into their life.
And it just makes you feel better just as well, doesn't it? Like it all just goes full circle. I think it'd be really helpful if you wouldn't mind giving a short explanation on some of these terms, because I wasn't aware of them until starting to dive into this subject. I can kind of guess, but eco-anxiety, ecological grief, and environmental doom. So these are all mental healthy kind of words, but what exactly, if we do
what
one
exactly
by one,
are they?
eco-anxiety, that seems to be the one that's flying around the most.
Yeah, I would love I would love to be able to give a very short response for the interest of time, but the truth is that these are terms that are rapidly evolving in our understanding from a research perspective, and also how people are using them. And so terms like eco-anxiety have been defined as things like a chronic fear of environmental doom. Ecological grief is maybe often used more to describe a grief around either current, past, or future even ecological losses and environmental damages. There's other terms like solastalgia that's been used to describe this sense of homesickness you can have when you're in a place that you love and feel connected to, but it's changing in ways that feel profoundly negative, and it doesn't feel like the home that you know and love anymore, due to things like mining or the climate crisis, etc. I think you said climate distress maybe as well, or ecological distress. And to be honest, like there is a lot of overlap between these terms and the way that they're used often. And there is a whole suite of emotional responses and psychological responses that might include emotions like fear, guilt, anger, sadness, powerlessness, hopelessness, grief, and also changes to our thinking, to the way we see the future, decisions we might be thinking of for the future. And for some people, these can become very disrupting. So it's affecting people's physiology and those sort of physiological symptoms of anxiety or lack of ability to sleep, or affecting people's relationships when other people feel differently about it. It's all really about like trying to grapple with the reality of the climate and ecological crises and it can overlap for some people with a very sort of existential anxiety. For many people around the world, this is a daily lived reality. So it's that fear about, not only what's happening now, but what does the future look like for me, my family, these environments. So these are very real experiences. They can be adaptive in that it's an understandable and even healthy response to have a strong response to the facts of the climate and ecological crises. But also for some people, it can become so overwhelming or paralyzing that it's inhibiting action, it's worsening their mental health. And so there is a real need for appropriate support and care and equipping people with the tools to protect their mental health and enable sustained kind of agency and doing that inner work to do the outer work. And even though it's very clear from people sort of working in this space that we don't want eco-anxiety to be seen as a clinical diagnosis or a problem that's individualized, when this is a whole of society kind of trauma and challenge that's happening. But it can also, for some people, be a motivating or an enabling force to say, oh, wow, like this is my body, my brain telling me like something's not right here and something needs to change, and I can be part of that. So yeah, people have very different experiences that might be multiple experiences in the same day, from day to day. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. Tell us about Climate Cares.
Yeah, thanks. So the Climate Cares Centre is based at Imperial College London, one of the only places in the world focusing on the intersection of climate change and mental health and well-being, by bringing together an Institute of Global Health Innovation and an Institute of Climate Change and the Environment, the Grantham Institute at Imperial. And we work across research, across policy, across education, across intervention design. We're really focused on how we can ensure that people around the world have their mental health protected in the climate crisis, but also that we're building psychological resilience of people and of organizations and systems so that they can take sustained climate action, and those actions can themselves help mental health and well-being.
And so if people wanted to check out some of your resources,
we have the Climate Cares website, which I can share if you look up the Climate Cares Centre. But also we've been working with partners around the world on this Wellcome funded Connecting Climate Minds initiative, which has brought together over 1,000 people now across over 90 countries to create both research and action agendas for climate change and mental health. So if you are interested, if you're listening and you're coming from a research space or a space where you could take action in civil society or in government or in funders or humanitarians or people with lived experience, you can see in all 7 Sustainable Development Goal regions around the world. So we divided the world up into 7 regions according to the way that the Sustainable Development Goals also work, and built communities of practice in all of those regions, bringing together regional community conveners and co-conveners of different organizations, but also lived experience advisory groups and youth ambassadors, all coming together to form these research and action agendas. And we did that as well with young people who led a whole series of dialogues by and for young people, and the same by and for Indigenous communities and small farmers and fisher peoples. So you can see all of those agendas, but also case studies that came out of things that are already happening around the world. Also stories, so if you want to watch short videos that are people around the world sharing their experiences. And also their hope and resilience, and also toolkits for people coming into this space. If you want a 101 on climate and mental health, or you want to learn how to work with people who have lived experiences in this space, or you are working as a decision maker and want to know more, and there's a collaborate area, you can find other people who are interested in this space as well. So lots going on to check out at hub.connectingclimateminds.org. So hub.connectingclimateminds.org.
We'll put that in the episode show notes too. As we are wrapping things up, I think to summarize, if that's even achievable, I have a question for you, Emma. What can the environment teach us about our mental health?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think the sense of connectedness, as I was saying before, that everything is connected, which is what we're learning more and more from research as well, that work needs to be really interdisciplinary now. You know, people aren't just doing their research in isolated disciplines anymore. They're realizing, oh, actually, I need to work with people who have knowledge from all these different backgrounds, but also knowledge from all different sorts of cultures and ways of knowing and being and doing. And also that we really need connection for our mental health, a sense of connection to ourselves, to others, to the natural world, and that we fundamentally belong. You know, there is when you feel a part of nature, when you realize you're a part of this bigger system, there's really a sense of belonging, of being part of something that's this beautiful, interconnected systems bigger than yourself. And, you know, for me, that's really powerful for my mental health. But also there's a huge power of nature to heal with space and time. And when we give ourselves that space and time to heal as well, and to, you know, see what can happen with just sometimes, you know, slowing down and giving that space and sitting with some of the challenges that we're facing and understanding how they're all interconnected, we can also provide some of that space to heal.
Thank you so much, Emma. We've got one last thing to do, and that's our signature sign off. So it's called the Happier Life Project's Last 5 in 5. They're kind of like quick fire questions. They're the same 5 questions that I ask every guest to conclude the episode. Okay. I'm sure you'll smash through these. Don't worry. When and where are you at your happiest?
It's a toss up with great people. So people that I love are sitting around a dinner table or having a conversation, in that space where you just feel held and connected to people you love and care about. And also in places, in natural places that I love. So on a bike, riding through the hills, or in between the gum trees near my family's home in Adelaide, watching the birds, all of those moments where you feel that connection to others, whether those others are trees or people.
What's your favorite thing to do that nourishes your mental health?
I think very overlapping actually with what I was saying before. So for me, conversations with loved ones are really important for my mental health, and spaces where I feel that sense of social support. And time in nature and exercise. I've also recently been doing more yoga nidra, which is this sort of body scanning practice. And I think for me, feeling more connected to my body, as someone who works in academic spaces and behind a computer as well, you can sometimes we can disconnect almost from all of these other parts of us. So that's been really helpful as well.
What piece of advice do you now know that you wished somebody would have told you earlier that would have made you a happier person?
Wow, these are really interesting questions. there's probably many things. I'll probably think of something when I wake up tomorrow morning or when I get this calls. I think something that has again come up in my work, but has also been really helpful is just the power of learning to hold sometimes uncertainty and paradox. And it's kind of, sometimes I can fall into a trap of thinking like, oh, when X, Y, and Z happens, then I'll be okay. But actually, if you focus on being okay, then you'll get things done, or things will happen sort of from that as well. Like, and I think that the same holds true in the climate crisis, that sometimes we can't forget to be nourishing ourselves and our communities and our social bonds, as well as, making sure that that's equipping us to do things in the wider world. But, we sort of can't have one without the other. So the power of sitting in messy systems and being okay with that has really helped me.
What is the most important one thing that needs to change to make the world a happier place?
I'm sure, again, there's lots, but fundamentally, a lot of the systems in which many people live don't measure the things that matter. They don't measure whether people are thriving, whether the planet is thriving. They don't measure the quality of social connections. They don't measure people's well-being. They don't measure the biodiversity. And so those things aren't taken into account in the fundamental decisions that are made in policies, in economics. And that is hugely to our detriment of the way that we create societies and the conditions that are needed for people to thrive. So I think an appreciation of the power of connection and the power of measuring what matters. But yeah, or at least accounting for what matters. It doesn't always have to be measured. And holding, again, multiple things together. If people have the power to just know that there are many different ways of knowing and being and doing, as they say in Indigenous communities in Australia, and that there is power in that. There's power in that diversity.
Okay, final question. What is a simple, actionable first step we can take when it comes to the climate crisis and our mental health that will help us on our journey to building a happier life?
One thing. So again, there's many things that people could do depending on sort of where they're starting from and where they're at in their life. But you're just encouraging people to create some space to think about how they are feeling, what they are doing, what they do value in life, and how they can maybe have some conversations about this as well, what they've learned from this podcast and their own reading, and creating that capacity to hold the challenging emotions and the hope together, and to see that things that they might want for a happier life, like what they really value, what they really love. If you are feeling anxious about the state of the world, it's probably because there are things that you love, there are people that you love, like it's a sign that you care. And so validate those emotions and see how they can be, part of creating that happier life, can also be doing things that are good for the world. And those two can really go hand in hand, because the ways to look after and protect what we love, what fundamentally people love, is often really aligned with creating a safer climate. And the more that we can talk about that, I think the better it'll be.
Dr. Emma Lawrance, thank you so much for today. I've learned so much, not just from our conversation, but also researching too. Like I said to you before, once you go down the rabbit hole, once you know, you can't unknow.
Yeah, I'm glad it's been so interesting. Yeah, thank you for having me on, and thank you so much.
Gabby, back with you. Thank you again, Dr. Emma Lawrance. And thank you to you for listening to this very important episode of the Happier Life Project podcast. As always, if you could just stay with me for one more minute of your time while I run through the crucial housekeeping. If you are suffering with your mental health, there is a crisis button on the My Possible Self app which will signpost you to the correct information for immediate expert advice. Those of you who are listening on one of the podcast platforms, the My Possible Self app is completely free to download, so you don't need to worry about it costing you anything. If you are in crisis or you think you may have an emergency, please do call your doctor or the emergency services immediately. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the interviewer, which is me, and the interviewees. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a substitute for professional or medical advice. Our partners at the Priory Healthcare are not involved in the production or content of this podcast. If you are listening on one of the podcast platforms and you found this episode helpful, and I really think how could you not, please do leave a review and share it with as many people as possible. For this episode in particular, we're not just talking about supporting people's mental health, but also our planet's health. And to find and follow us on social media if you're not already there. We have a presence on most of the major platforms, particularly Instagram, and we're at My Possible Self across the board, and I've been at Radio Gabby. Do take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.